Sign language seems to have been passed down across generations, possibly for the purpose of communicating effectively. But not only that, it also originated with gesture in its earliest form. It was created by individuals, but grew to being used by an entire community like this, one that shares the language. Not only has its use continued, it has evolved, changing possibly to make it better suited for both perception and production. Now, take a look at this person on stage. He's capable of giving a full performance in ASL, but also consider where language is really expressed. Does he use all the space around him? I'll show you. Structure means grammar along with information, a message that you receive not by someone using the whole body, but really just using this portion. ASL only engages the top half of the body, and that is sufficient to be able to talk about the full range of possible human action, objects, or the world, all within this constrained signing space. What led to the reorganization of sign space? Some studies say the structure is shaped by constraints in order to make the language more efficient. So the language may have been reorganized or structured to meet those constraints. I'll talk more about that. Now, linguistic information is processed in the brain, but we don't use our whole brain. Most of the time, we use the left hemisphere for processing that kind of linguistic information. Because it's language, we use the left hemisphere. The same is true for spoken languages. Studies show that they're processed in the left hemisphere. Signers have also been found to process signed linguistic information in their left hemispheres. Also, people were surprised to learn that even this kind of visual information, a simple silhouette where you can only see the outline of a person, can be understood by fluent signers. Take a look at this video. This person is describing a fitful night of sleep due to a nightmare. So space is reduced to a two-dimensional plane, yet language can still be perceived like this. It is different than normal because how you perceive it has changed, but it's interesting that people can still understand it despite the absence of full detail. For example, his eyes can't be seen, nor exactly where his hands contact his torso, yet the message is completely intelligible. Also, consider a person who happens to be right-handed as opposed to someone who uses their left hand. Or if a right-handed person has to use their non-dominant hand to produce the same type of sentence, they can use their left hand. I'll show you an example. This will be of the same person. The person is again describing a fitful night of sleep due to a nightmare. Often, people who are fluent signers, socialize in the deaf community, or are lifelong signers report not even noticing when someone is left-handed, especially if that person is also fluent. This means that language does not depend on handedness. What's important is that all units work together as a whole, appropriately coordinated. That's how listeners attend to and extract information. Now, that's one thing we learned, that handedness does not matter, yet it's a challenge for learning. People who didn't grow up signing and instead learned later in life often aren't sure which hand to use when copying their teachers, yet this isn't challenging for native or lifelong signers. An interesting point arises from this. What kind of information is important for a language in the visual manual modality? I'll show you a breakdown of these components. All of these components are called parameters, and some are considered primary parameters. You may have heard of these before, and we'll see them mentioned again throughout the course. These three seem to be present in the video clip you just saw, but there's other information in the video that was omitted. This means that maybe there are things we are used to seeing, like details on the face, that are optional because they're redundant. Details do appear in the visual medium, but not everything is essential for language and thus can be omitted. That's how a silhouette with no details can still be understood. However, there is a limit. I'll talk about that more. Other parameters were later found to be linguistically distinctive, including hand orientation, facial expression, and repetition. The first one, hand orientation, which refers to the angle of one's palm, has been deemed essential. At the outset of research on ASL, only these three parameters were considered primary, but didn't include hand orientation. I'll explain this. For example, in the video you just saw, you should have noticed that we had to place the camera carefully so that the viewing angle would work. If it were shot head-on, the experiment wouldn't have worked. The signer had to be filmed from a side angle so that their hands would be silhouetted too and thus visible. From a head-on angle, the shadow of the torso would mask the hands whenever they're placed in front of the body. So we knew the viewing angle was important. And also, when looking at hand orientation, we also had to train people to articulate their hands clearly so that their fingers could be easily seen. If their fingers were masked by their palms, then the message would be unintelligible. That means we can identify the essential, distinctive features by controlling what information is visible. With just that information, signers can understand without much difficulty at all because their brain processes these features automatically. Now, let's compare hand orientation to facial expression. In the film clip, you couldn't actually see the person's face, only their profile. You couldn't see their eyes or their eye gaze. Now, in this story, the eye gaze wasn't important because you knew that the signer was facing someone else. But in everyday conversation, often we maintain eye contact. What is the function of eye contact then? It's important for maintaining engagement. If I look away while signing, this is essential information. The listener knows that an eye gaze shift cues the establishment of a spatial referent. Once that reference location has been noted, you don't need to keep using eye gaze because when using language, interlocutors should maintain eye contact. Now that's key because when you do break eye contact, it means that something important has happened. Now, those examples can help you figure out what it means to be linguistically distinctive. And that relates to the last point. Repetition is also an essential parameter. It has to do with the fact that each sign form can be repeated and that repetition itself means something. The actual number of repetitions isn't important. The key distinctions are between one, two, and many. That kind of contrastive information is starting to be studied more closely. And that's the type of linguistic information that the brain, especially the left hemisphere, pays close attention to. Now lastly, I'll summarize this comparison of language aspects. These are essential properties of language. And we'll see what those properties are in signed and spoken modes. Input means how one perceives information. In the signed modality, this is done visually, while in spoken languages, it's done auditorily. This means they are two distinct modes. They also differ in their output, how one produces language. Sign languages are expressed using these articulators. The hands include orientation, while digits refers to how many fingers are extended or closed. This is also a linguistically distinctive parameter. And the face. You get information from the eyes and the upper body, but not the rest of the body. It seems that gesture may use the entire body, which is studied by some, but in sign language, signing space is far more constrained. That's also part of the output. Similarly, when watching someone else, you focus on that signing space and these articulators. Now, for spoken languages, how do you discriminate individual sounds? Studies show that this has to do with how to produce sound using these articulators, the mouth, tongue, and vocal tract. Now, that's not all. The processing of information must also be considered, or the flow of information. In comparing the two, we find that words in spoken language, which are made up of many sounds, are produced in a pretty fast stream as compared to sign languages because physical movements are slower and larger, so it takes a longer time to produce a single word. I'll talk more about how that's measured.